Good morning. I'm Rachel Bronson. I'm a senior advisor at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and I'm delighted to be with you today, along with my two esteemed guests. Let me start by framing our conversation on targeting nuclear power before we jump in, and a thank you to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists for hosting this very important conversation today. So, to frame our discussion, we are learning significant lessons about the future of warfare from Operation Epic Fury, the American and Israeli operation attack on Iran. And one of the things we're learning is this terrible reality that nuclear power plants are becoming targets in wartime. Recent events are not the first time that we're seeing this. The Russian shelling of Zaporizhzhia in Ukraine, Europe's largest nuclear power plant, established this shocking precedent. But over the past few weeks, Iran has targeted Dimona, Israel's nuclear facility, and the US and Israel have hit areas quite close to Bushehr, Iran's civilian nuclear power plant. Russia has reportedly been evacuating its own workers from Bushehr, and Rafael Grossi, the director of the IAEA, has voiced serious concerns about possible leaks at Bushehr if fighting continues. Iranian officials have reminded Tel Aviv and Washington quite ominously that Bushehr is closer to Doha and Dubai than it is to Tehran. All of this is happening at a time when leaders around the world are galloping towards or adding more nuclear power to their energy mix for at least three very good reasons. The first is to protect against the vulnerabilities of energy dependence, which are playing out before our eyes, to serve growing populations in energy poor areas, and to fuel the insatiable demand of data centers, which are predicted to drive a quote unquote infinite demand of energy. In this context, and in this reality, how should we be thinking about safety and security of nuclear power in this fast changing and violent security environment? So today, I am delighted to be joined by exactly the right people to help us address these important issues. So to do so, I'll begin with a discussion with our speakers and then move to some questions from the chat. Please add your questions directly into the chat. I'll try to incorporate them into our discussion. And then at the end, we'll have time for a few of them directly. But let me introduce our speakers. So Laura S.H. Holgate served most recently as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations International Organizations in Vienna and as the representative of the U.S. to the IAEA. She currently leads LSHH International Advisors, offering consulting services at the intersection of nuclear energy and nuclear security. Laura's public service includes the reduction of threats and management of risks from nuclear, biological, chemical, and radiological weapons. She previously served as vice president at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, NTI, the special assistant to the president at the National Security Council, and as a senior official in the US Department of Energy and Department of Defense. Lars van Dassen is the executive director of the World Institute for National Security. He has worked in the nuclear nonproliferation and security field for more than 30 years. At the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority, he was responsible for the implementation of international projects, primarily in the field of nuclear security in Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Moldova, and the Baltic states. And he served as acting director or acting department head and section head at the director for the Office of External Relations. He was sous Sherpa for Sweden at the nuclear security summits held between 2010 and 2016. So let's jump right in. Laura and Lars, you both spent considerable time working in and around the former Soviet Union when we were worried about their nuclear programs and how they would be managed in the post-Soviet era. I want to take us back to that so we can set ourselves up for a contemporary conversation. But Lars, I'm going to start with you. Can you set the scene for us for discussing a bit about the origins of and the trajectory of today's reality in which nuclear facilities are now within the lines of conflict based on what you were working on in the past? So can you set us up in the past so we can get to what that means for this trajectory and the future?
Yeah, I can try to do that very short. In that case, what I would know the most about is former Soviet Union. But I think there's nevertheless somehow also a pattern that we have to dissect, and that is that if we look at the facilities that have been mainly have been subject to attacks, then those are cases like Osirak in 1981, the reactor in Syria, and what is now unfolding in Iran. Those are facilities that are then related to proliferation concerns by those attacking. If we look at what has unfolded in Eastern Europe, then it is occupation of nuclear facilities. Um, and we tend to, now when we discuss it and think about it, then we say, yes, it's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I think here we are really making a shortcut, and maybe also making a shortcut that creates some problems for us. Because the first facility to be occupied, that was actually the research reactor in Sevastopol in Crimea in 2014. And it's as if that has been completely forgotten. And I think when we forget that, we also forget a couple of lessons, because that occupation of the reactor and its transfer to Russian custody, of course, had consequences for the IAEA safeguards. The reactor was under the IAEA safeguards for Ukraine, and suddenly under no IAEA safeguards, because Russia notified that now it was a Russian facility. So he was a safeguard situation that was unforeseen, not taken care of. Then I think then came the occupation of Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plants. And we know how that went. The good thing about that, I think it's an interesting historical lesson, is that we have a situation of 3 nuclear power plants that have been occupied in this manner. It's all been done by Russia. It's all been done in Ukraine. But the good news is that it is also possible to release that occupation. That has happened with the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So if it can happen one time, then it can maybe also happen again. Then there is a small interjection I want to make, but I think it's a very interesting case, and it's something that Laura will remember. And this is from March 2022. There was a Board of Governors meeting of the IAEA, and at that meeting, there was an accusation by Russia made against Ukraine that at another Ukrainian nuclear facility, namely Khmelnytsky, Ukraine had a nuclear weapons program. This was, of course, completely bogus, but the interesting thing was how that could be rejected, of course, with reference to the IAEA's safeguards in place. So I think that we maybe see something that has a couple of patterns inbuilt. And I think when we see patterns, we can also see, or it begs us to discuss things with a little bit of distinction that would maybe otherwise be lost. I'm a little bit careful when it is that people say that when something happens, then it's the same as something that has shortly happened before, but it's maybe possible to see a couple of distinction unfolding in the population of nuclear facilities that have been targets, so to speak.
Laura, maybe picking up on this and continuing to establish the background for it. Lars just laid out 3 different cases. Can you talk about a little bit from your view those 3 cases, and are those the 3 cases you're thinking about in terms of precedent of where we're going, or are there others that you'd like to draw in as well?
Well, I would say.
Lars, let me just have Laura come back, and then I'm going to come
Okay,
back to you on
good,
that.
fine. Yes, please.
Yeah.
So I think there's a couple interesting patterns in some of the cases that Lars mentioned, and that is, prior to Ukraine, every one of those attacks occurred on a facility that was under construction and that had no nuclear materials present. And so while there are sovereignty issues, there are certainly laws of war issues and so on, there was no risk of nuclear contamination. or any larger kind of nuclear incident that came from those attacks. So I think that's one thing. And I think the second point that jumped out at me when Lars mentioned the 3 cases of Russian seizure, or as another scholar in this issue calls it, nuclear piracy. Ali Alkes has debuted that phrase in the bulletin. The is that kind of silly feint that somehow this was also a non-proliferation step by Russia to prevent Ukraine from getting, from pursuing a weapons or further pursuing a weapons program, or attempt to halt that. So Russia tried to wrap their seizures in a non-proliferation wrapper, and as Lars said, it just completely failed. So I think those are a couple of interesting points. When Lars and I first started working on these issues together, there was a very strong separation between these concepts of nuclear security and nuclear safety. And in the US, that manifested itself in some, frankly, not very productive ways, in which the work that we were doing under the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program only had resources to fund security. And while there were a number of reactor safety challenges throughout the post-Soviet era, the U.S. had very limited resources. They had to be appropriated through a different different mechanism and institution, executed through different tools. And as a result, Europe really carried a lot more because there was less of a distinction made, and because Europe was frankly probably more likely to be affected by any kind of a nuclear safety incident. And so what we're seeing now is a recognition that the safety and security issues are extremely strongly connected. And this effort by the two disciplines to kind of separate each from themselves is, we're now being driven back together. And that's, not necessarily good or bad, but it's different. And it's going to take some adjustment in how we approach these issues going forward.
I think there's something really important about what you both just said, that in a sense, in the past, right, it had been about counterproliferation. And now in the Russia case, it's more clearly about energy security. They're both national security issues. And this is where I think that the energy folks are like, this is security as well, national security. But these issues that we've seen in the past, the Israeli strike in Syria and Iraq, were about counter non-proliferation under the auspices of that. And I think what you're saying now is what we've seen in these Russian cases, which are quite applicable to how we're thinking about it now, were really about energy security, or Russia denying that to Ukraine, which I think is quite fascinating and important, how all of this is beginning to collapse in. So let me just add this other bit about nuclear safety. I think this fits under nuclear safety, but there could be a growing sense, right, that reactors are easy to compromise, and it's important because Grossi has been saying, like, be careful, we keep striking around Bushehr and it could begin to fail, crack, compromise, leak. Can you both talk about how reactor safety has evolved? It's important kind of lessons learned after 9/11 and Fukushima. There's been important safety adjustments just to set the stage for our audience about how vulnerable or fragile are these in general, and then we can bring that up to the context of what's happening now. Laura, why don't you start with that, and Lars, will come back to you after that.
Well, I think what we learned from both of those instances was what, in technical terms, we call a beyond design basis event. A design basis event is the thing that a reactor operator is responsible for protecting against, whether it's an accident or whether it's some kind of an intentional attack or incursion. And usually, up until now, that on the intentionality thing, it's been understood primarily as a non-state actor, which is another thing that's really a distinction between what Russia's been doing in a whole, multiple decades of nuclear security work. So there's been a lot of steps taken in both the security and the safety realm to be more ready to respond to some of these things, to have more flexible activities and or capabilities. And I've toured some of these at a U.S. power plant, which had showed how they had taken extra steps and added extra layers of backups to the backups to the backups for some of the known challenges that came out of the Fukushima accident. We saw the same thing in post 9/11 as nuclear security measures were, kind of added to the existing fleet. The challenge with both of those is post facto, they're very expensive. They're expensive to add on and they're expensive to maintain. And so we have this opportunity, among all of the glasses half full, glasses half empty in the relationship with nuclear energy and this current situation of nuclear power plants under threat. We have the opportunity with these new designs to really take the lessons of Fukushima and 9/11 into account on the drawing board before you get a license, before you build it. And when you do that, the readiness to deal with these severe incidents can be more affordable and more effective.
Great, thank you. Lars, picking up on this, we have a question that's come through that's asking about how the UAE, from our YouTube channel, how the UAE is managing to secure their nuclear power plants. And I think in the context of what Laura's talking about, they're expanding their plans and considering, so if, how maybe they're thinking about it, especially in light of what's going on. You're sitting in Europe, and Europe is considering moving forward in a number of places where nuclear power plants. So maybe those lessons for you are more immediate in Europe. But I'd love your thoughts on what Laura's talking about, right? Because obviously after Fukushima, it was about geological incidents. And after 9/11, it was fear of a plane hitting these plants in as if they were missiles. So your thoughts on that in either Europe, or if you have thoughts on the UAE as well.
See, I would like to maybe answer it more generically. So one of the things that has happened with and after the Russian occupation of parts of Ukraine is that it now stands out that state actors are into this. And we have lived for many decades thinking, okay, the main perpetrators and the largest enemies here, they are terrorist groups. But suddenly that changes. And I can give a couple of snapshots in terms of how that has changed. During the days when Russia started its invasion of Ukraine, there were drones that were overflying Swedish nuclear power plants.
Wait, say that again. You cut out, and it's really important. So
yeah, there were drones that were flying over Swedish nuclear power plants just simultaneously with the opening of the attacks on Ukraine. There are also now it's daily occurrences for, I mean, I think probably most operators, that there are cyber attacks, and some of them are severe. I heard a North American person saying to me, there's one facility in North America that has been exposed to such harsh cyber attacks that had they been physical, then it would have been a declaration of war. I have had discussions also in Japan where it is that then people, were just 2 years prior to it, people would say, well, the main issues we see in nuclear security, that is insider threats and, corruption, things like that. So suddenly turning around and say, well, the main threats that we see in nuclear security, that is our 3 closest neighboring countries. So China, Russia, and North Korea. And that is a radical shift. And that is, I mean, but it's also part and parcel of the whole preponderance. embedded in how the world is changing. It's more and more states that are making up the international interaction. It's not NGOs, it's not various groups, et cetera, et cetera. It's all under a state-driven dynamic for good and for bad. But so it comes to play also in this domain. So there are things really here to be careful of for anyone who has and wants to have nuclear infrastructure, of course. That is, however, not something new. But I think that one thing is new or also changing, and that is the perception of risks. I think that, maybe 20, 25 years ago, our perception of risks, it has to be almost zero. It was for anything you discussed, then it was yes, but could there be an accident? And now we know it doesn't matter whether you choose wind energy or you have use fossil fuels or nuclear energy. It comes with a price tag that is a risk tag. It's unavoidable. And we're maybe realizing this and coming maybe also to terms with it. And if that is the case, then I think the increased awareness can also be a very, very helpful tool in overcoming what is our threat. I'd like to add one thing on the safety security dimension, and here comes one thing that has stood out from what we have worked with partners in Ukraine on in terms of the occupation of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And it is that there are many things in nuclear security and safety that have actually been unforeseen and uncalibrated for this new situation that has come up with state actors. One of them is, for instance, those forces that were defending the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plants. They did so with a restraint because they knew what it was that they were defending, and if there would be an escalation, then it could go really bad with the infrastructure behind them. This is something, if you look in what our various guidance systems are like for nuclear security, it's not something that's really been given consideration. So a lot of new things have actually come up. If you look at, for instance, issues that used to be purely safety functions, like diesel generators as backup for electricity production for reactors, making sure that there is diesel available for these diesel generators. That is a safety function. But if you're occupied, then it's only a security function. But it's a little bit like in physics with dimensions that you have like folded up inside each other, that it becomes a new, different security parameter if you are then carrying out your duties in a facility that is already occupied. It becomes completely different. You have to carry it out as a safety function, as a security function, while there's probably someone walking around pointing a gun at you. So this has left us with a lot of new issues that we need to grapple with.
I think you're highlighting the role of how we think about risk is very important, because up till quite recently, I was very frustrated with how we talked about nuclear power, right? Because we didn't talk about the risks that coal, contributed to the environment. We didn't talk about the risks of the Chinese owning the solar supply chains, right? We didn't talk about these risks and we only focused, or I thought we focused considerably on the risks of nuclear power. The reason I want to have this conversation is now with this galloping towards nuclear power and the recognition that energy dependence leads to energy vulnerability, we shouldn't forget that there are some real risks, and we're seeing them play out in the nuclear power space that we haven't thought before, so that we can effectively evaluate our risks as we're thinking about the future of energy security, especially in the context of national security. So I think that notion of risk is important, and hopefully we'll have time to get back to SMRs and how we think about that, and waste. And those are some questions that are coming up from the chat as well. Laura, before we do that though, I want to take some time to focus on, Lars just talked about this changing context, as have you. And I know you're thinking a lot about the role of the IAEA moving forward and what its role has been and maybe what it needs to be. as we think through this future. Can you spend some time on that, and then we'll turn to some of these other issues like SMRs and waste.
Yeah, I think it's really been remarkable the role that the IAEA has stepped up to in the Ukraine context without any change to its statute. And I think that was a genius move by Director General Rafael Grossi when he first introduced the 7 pillars around nuclear safety and security and they were generic pillars. They weren't specifically related to Zaporizhzhia, but they derive all from existing consensus guidance and standards that the IAEA has generated over the last several years. And so there was no way really for anybody to object to them. And then that created the basis, combined with Ukraine's request for assistance under the treaty on assistance in the case of radiological incidents, as well as Ukraine's comprehensive safeguards agreement and additional protocol. That combination created the space for the IAEA to create these teams that have gone in and been in residence for months at a time at these nuclear facilities all over Ukraine. And they're not they're there to do safeguards work, of course, which is part of a reflection of Ukrainian sovereignty over those facilities. But they are also giving advice to the operators on safety and security. They're walking down the plants. They are, reporting back to IAEA what they see. Now, both sides have been frustrated with the limits of what the IAEA has been able to say, because IAEA is not doing attribution. They're not saying there was, a drone attack or a missile fragment from one side or the other. And frankly, they're not equipped to do that. That's not their job. It's not their training. But it does mean that some of the hopes that folks had for what role these teams could play has not actually come to pass. That would take, in my view, a change in the statute and a change in the training if people wanted the IAEA to move into that type of verification, which is very different from the verification that's embedded in their well understood, very strong legal grounding for their international safeguards work. So that's everything that they're doing in Ukraine is funded by extra budgetary donations. That is not coming out of the IAEA's regular budget, which tells you something about the very tenuous financial situation that this organization is in, one that we're asking to do so much now and will be asking to do even more if this nuclear renewal lives up to even some of the expectations that have been set for it. And so I think, the IAEA can only do the will of its members. It does not have an independent will. And so it can only do the things that its members let it do. And so when the members say we will hold the IAEA to a zero growth budget, the way many countries, many rich countries do across the United Nations agencies, I would say the IAEA maybe has a special case here than some of the other UN agencies. And we really need to be reconsidering as member states what the budget should be to support the whole range of expectations and needs from the safety, security, and safeguards side, but also on the peaceful uses side, whether it's nuclear energy or whether it's a whole range of non-power activities that countries are desperate to have the IAEA help them with on health and agriculture and water management and climate adaptation and all of those techniques. And so I really think we need to reconsider the impecunious character of this agency on which we're hanging so much confidence across the safety and security, as well as the nonproliferation and safeguards agenda.
And so and you've addressed this, and for both of you, and because you mentioned Aliakis right in the beginning, he has sent in a question just of whether, and I think you're getting at this, but whether the mission in and around Zaporizhzhia provides the template for moving forward, if that's what we should be really building our lessons around to understand for the IAEA what's coming, or maybe even broaden it as you're mentioning.
Well, I'll let Lars speak to that because he's been doing a lot of work on the Zaporizhzhia situation.
Lars, do you want to take
Yeah,
that?
well, I would say yes, it's a good start. I think there are a couple of effects that are not really appreciated enough in terms of what it is that the IA is doing. But I'm sure that once this is all over, and when it is that there'll be people who investigate this, speak with the people at the plant, who speak with the IAEA staff who's been there, then they will discover that the IAEA's presence has been conflict cushioning. The mere fact that they were there has had benevolent effect, and maybe keeping a couple of things from not escalating, certain types of violence from not occurring, etc., etc. And each time that is done, then it's of course very important. I think this case will be very instrumental, both in terms of the on-the-ground learnings, but also from the 7 principles, the pillars that Laura referred to. Because actually, and this is very central, you mentioned, Rachel, about supply chain, but these principles and pillars, they also refer to issues of the centrality of the supply chain. The supply chain is also part and parcel of what it is that is safety. If you run out of spare parts, etc., etc., if you run out of equipment for security, then suddenly you have security safety issues that are highly problematic. So there is a whole circuit of things that come together, and that will probably be it will be a big piece of international work to try to dissect the experiences and say, okay, how can that equip us with tools for the future?
There's so much to go into on all of these points. I don't want us to finish off without talking about waste, though. I've spent, my previous question was on the physical security of the plant itself, and yet we have these pools of waste, and we don't have, except your part of the world, Lars, we don't have good answers for how to store it. And I guess in Russia too a bit, but what new risks does waste pose, especially as countries start moving towards rethinking nuclear power as a homegrown response to energy independence? Is that something that we should be thinking about? There's a couple of questions on that from the YouTube channels for both of you. Laura, do you want to start, since Lars has just given some thought, and let him think about it? Or yeah.
Yes, well, I think it's right to look at the waste in pools as a distinct issue from the reactor itself, which modern reactors have extensive reinforced concrete domes and containment capabilities and so on. And so that's a different thing. And then there's a lot of spent fuel in dry cask storage, it's called, that may be on the site, but are in massive concrete containers that have themselves been tested to withstand a whole range of very extreme insults. The fuel in the pools are more challenging because they're more vulnerable and they're more radioactive. And so an accident or an incident that spreads that radioactivity could be quite damaging. And one of the things that's been interesting about some of the articles about if Bushehr were to be attacked, because they have so much fuel in their spent fuel pools, that it could be more of a waterborne problem with contamination of the ocean that is used for for water for desalination for the whole region. which is a very different contamination context than Chernobyl. Everybody likes to say, oh, it's going to be another Chernobyl. No, it's not going to be another Chernobyl. This is a totally different reactor technology, but it doesn't mean it's harmless. And in this case, it's the spent fuel in the pools that could generate a range of contamination that could be quite damaging across the region. I think it depends. It depends on the age of the fuel.
Yeah. Do you think that's maybe what the Iranians were getting at when they were reminding the world of how close Doha and Dubai were to the plant, especially in the context of attacks on desalinization plants and things like that? It was this concept of what the risks actually were for that reactor. Would that make sense to you? Laura, do you think that's what?
Oh, that was to me. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'll go to Lars in a second. It's just it seemed like such a logical. Yeah.
I think, humans are not known to be rational about how we think about nuclear risks. So I don't think it even needed to be that specific about, oh, it could, these specific radionuclides could contaminate the water, which could create a problem. No, I think it was just look at the map, think about the prevailing winds, who's gonna be harmed most, whether that's accurate or not. I think it's a throwaway line in a way from Iran just to create more fear within the region.
Lars, anything from you on I do think it's important to talk about that we understand how protected these reactors are. I know there is some concern that they weren't necessarily built to withstand the kind of missile attacks and possibly repeated that we're seeing. But your thoughts on the risks versus reactor versus pools and how to think about that. And then I want to make sure we have time because there's questions from the chat on the SMRs.
Now, see, if we end up in a world where it is that reactors have to be constructed in such a manner that they can withstand missile attacks, direct hits, etc., then it makes nuclear energy incredibly expensive and very difficult, and it will of course also influence what it is that the public thinks about it. So we have to hope for that we don't end up there, but hope is not a strategy in itself. We have to think of something more and better what it is that can be accomplished in order to make sure that some level of civility sets in here. On one hand, I'm pessimistic. Yeah, I saw today there was a European head of state who said international law is gone. It's a sad reality, but it's gone. If that's the case, then it also affects, of course, international law in this area. If that happens, then we have to think of something else, and that is also that what is it that states could then agree on as being reciprocally beneficial? That, I mean, if I would do this to them, they might do the same to me, and vice versa. If I don't do it to them, so a different kind of codex, a different kind of thinking, and this is why I think, after all, a relationship between the military tendencies and the weakening of the non-proliferation norm and a relationship to the civilian and peaceful uses is possible, where you could think that, okay, we are also an exporting country. We need to keep that in the balance in terms of how we act and react internationally in general. I think the waste issue you mentioned is somehow plays into this in a very intricate manner, in an interesting way. When we say waste, then we have to think of that there are waste products that are radioactive products that are not really reusable for other purposes. But it also includes spent nuclear fuel, and spent nuclear fuel is reusable. And here we see many things happening with SMR technologies that go into exploring these opportunities of reprocessing. So that would be a civilian component and additional use of a material that is otherwise expensive to handle and has to be handled for hundreds or thousands of years. That can be an opportunity. On the other hand, one thing that is pulling in the other direction is that now when I follow this debate about countries that are considering the issues of, well, we are not sure of this or that security guarantee anymore, and we have to consider alternatives. When they then have to look at, well, what are our alternatives in terms of having access to fissile materials? Then, of course, one of the things that they would have to consider that is if they have spent nuclear fuel and what can be extracted from that. That in turn brings us back to what Laura said, and that I think is absolutely crucial. The salience of the role of the IAEA. And that zero growth budgets is maybe not what we need when it is that we need more safeguards to make sure that we can accomplish this civil and civilizing role in the middle of everything.
I'm mindful that we're coming to the end of our time, and I want to give the two of you options, the opportunity to pull some of this together. There's a lot that's come out of the discussion, and I think conceptually, just for the audience, as we round this out, the coming together of nuclear security and nuclear safety, right, is a very important aspect of it. And I think this energy security as national security also fits into this distinction between civilian and weapons programs, that it's important to separate. They're very different, and they have different motivators and different infrastructures and all of that, but they're merging in ways, and they're intersecting in ways that are very new, that I think this community should really spend some time thinking about. But I'd like for the two of you to think about, just in the time we have left, maybe some last thoughts on, given what we're seeing in the Iran war, what are things that you are looking at? Or I'm looking at questions from the chat. There's some questions about other international organizations. There's some questions about AI, whether that makes us safer or greater risk in the context. I have questions on the supply chain that we didn't really get to, on how secure are we, but mindful of time. I think, Lars, we started with you, so I'm going to go back to you for some concluding remarks. So Laura, then Lars kicked us off, you get to close us out with some last thoughts. So Lars, as we've had this conversation, any kind of thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with?
Well, I think this sounds so general that it is tautological, but it is very important to have a growing community that is engaged in these issues. And it is also, in this ultimately, the most important is to have a community of decision makers. And here I think most of all on the representatives that are then on the board of governors of the IAEA, that are decision makers that are comfortable with the issues. When they come, because they'll be coming now at a speed that is higher and higher, and actually unforeseen issues not really been there before, and you have to relate to completely new things, maybe outside of the statute, on the edge of the statute, etc., things that can be very, very difficult and uncomfortable. So I would. And I think that this is a responsibility not only for the few and the existing mighty, but actually for all countries that are central in the nuclear dealings, that they make sure that they have people available that can go into these discussions and contribute well, so that we also get outcomes that are good and helpful for all of us. And this is where we have to think again that the IAEA is actually, it is the place in the world that is dealing with decision making for this issue. There's not another one that does only that, and with such quality. So we should all put ourselves behind what it was that Laura said before, that zero growth budget is not maybe the most helpful thing.
Lars, I would also add to that, in addition to all of our leaders, I think we're going to increasingly see the importance of this in the private sector as well, as we start seeing the private sector playing such an important role, that they make space in their, and this is things that, you know, it broadens the audience for this, that to make space for those who can think about these cross-secting issues in ways that are obvious to those who've worked on safety and security issues, but maybe not those who are spending time thinking about how to power a data center. Laura, how about you help wrap this up? And it's clearly going to be, this discussion is just the beginning of ones that the bulletin will and should have, but some final thoughts from you.
Yeah, well, just to touch on the SMR issue, I do think it's important to make distinctions when we talk about the potential impacts of a military action against a nuclear facility, of what the details of that facility are. And, you know, the S in SMR stands for small, and that means there's less nuclear material. And so that means that there is less possibility. I mean, there's just less material there to be spread around or to be dispersed in various incidents or accidents. And so that doesn't mean you have to be you have to be cavalier, but it does mean that you have to be careful. The fuel types are also going to be different, some of which may be very similar to the types we know and love today, and some of which may be very different. And so understanding the character of the quantity of material, the character of material, the character of the fuel types is going to be really critical to understanding what the impacts of various incidents could be, whether man-made or accidental. But we do, again, have a chance to take these issues into account before these things get built, and we have to do the very expensive, you know, add-on afterwards. Safety by design, security by design, safeguards by design. That kind of discipline at the current stage that we're in with these reactors can go a long way towards mitigating some of the risks that we've been talking about today.
Great, thank you. Well, I think what's clear is that the frameworks that we need to bring to these issues are changing, or need to change, because the world is changing and the technology is changing, and the environment in which we're operating is changing in ways I think that both of you have pointed out are very different. We're in a very different context in many ways, not always, but in many ways, from where we were maybe 20 years ago to where we are today. And it's just going to move ever faster. The good news, I think, for all of us is people like Lars and Laura are working on this and thinking about it regularly. There's a lot of work to be done. So there's a lot that we're putting onto their shoulders. But on behalf of the Bulletin, I want to thank both you, Lars and Laura, for joining us, and for our audience joining us for taking interest in these important issues. So with that, thank you very much, and we are adjourned.